Hello everyone, Silent K here, and we've got a new expansion coming up, so it's time to do some card reviews. The new expansion, Rise of Bahamut, is slated for release December 29th. Now before we get started, the last card review I did, I wasn't really too happy with the format, so we'll be trying something a little different this time. This time I'm going to list a few pros and cons for each card, and each one will be worth plus or minus points toward the overall score of the card. So each card will have a total score and a breakdown for how it got that score. So even if two different cards got the same score, they might have arrived at it different ways. Like maybe one is just an average card, while one has a strong positive and a strong negative, so they both even out. We'll give that a try. And I won't be going into the arena value of each card, because arena is basically just about pure minion value. It's not really worth spending a lot of time talking about it. Alright, so let's get into the card reviews, but first we have some new mechanics. The first new mechanic is Enhance. Enhanced cards will have a default cost and then an enhanced cost, so you can get additional effects if you have more mana to spend on it. And this should work much like Necromancy, whereas if you have the mana then you have to spend it on the enhanced effect. You probably won't get the choice, even though that hasn't been confirmed or denied yet. But going forward, the reviews will assume that you have to pay the additional cost if you have the mana to spend. And the second new mechanic is called Clash. The Clash effect takes place whenever either the minion attacks or defends from an attack. So if a spell is used to remove a Clash minion, the effect does not go off. It has to be involved in combat in some way. Alright, on to the cards. We'll be going in order of class alphabetically, and neutrals last. First up for Bloodcraft, Mastema. 5 mana 6/6, Bane, can only attack the enemy leader and followers with ward. My immediate thought was this was trash. It's a little better than Beast Dominator in some ways, but you can't attack any followers. And being a 5-cost card right in the middle of the Evolve Wars, being able to evolve and trade into something is extremely important. But it does handle ward, and for 5 mana, the way an aggressive deck usually handles ward is with Dance of Death, so I think it's best compared directly with that card. So for Dance of Death, you typically pay 5 mana, remove a problematic minion, and then since it's an aggressive deck, you probably use your evolve point to aggressively evolve something that's already on the board. So basically Dance of Death is remove a minion, deal 4 damage to face, and protect your board. And here Mastema, you play for 5 mana. You spend the evolve point on her instead of an existing minion. You smash into the ward. She almost assuredly survives since there's very few ways to have a ward minion on the board with 8 or more attack. Your stuff still stays on the board, and then a minion is left for the opponent to deal with. So on the positive side, it is pretty aggressively statted, and it does have potential to replace Dance of Death in a hyper-aggressive deck, but on the minus side, it's a completely useless evolution target if there's no ward on the board. You could still play it and then aggressively evolve something else on the board, but sometimes there are problematic minions that don't have wards, so in some situations it's not going to help you. So the overall score I'm going to give is a 0. That is a neutral score, going from like a negative score for bad cards to a positive score for good cards. I think it has the potential to replace Dance of Death in aggressive decks, but it's not strictly better, so we'll see. Next up for Dragoncraft, Breath of the Salamander, the first enhanced card. It is 2 mana by default and deals 3 damage to a single enemy follower. Enhance 6, then deal 2 damage to all enemy followers. So if you have 2 mana, it's basic 2 mana deal 3 damage removal. In the later game, when you have 6 mana, you can spend 6 to deal 5 damage to one enemy and 2 damage to every other enemy follower. So on the plus side, it's a very good effect for 2 mana, it's a great effect for 6 mana, and it's the only Dragoncraft AoE that is one-sided. All the other Dragoncraft AoEs deal damage to both sides of the board. This card goes 1 for 1 with Otohime. One minor setback though is that you can't combo the 2 mana version with Siegfried, because if you have Siegfried in your hand, obviously you have 6 mana, so you can't hit something for 3 and then follow up with Siegfried. You would just do the AoE attack instead. So it only combos with him on 10 mana, which isn't nearly as useful. But that's only a very minor setback. Overall score, a massive +3. This card will probably be in every Dragoncraft deck. Extremely useful card. Next up for Forestcraft, White Wolf of Eldwood. 8 mana legendary. It's a 4/4 rush with last words. Randomly put one of the highest cost Forestcraft cards, excluding White Wolf of Eldwood, from your deck into your hand at the start of your next turn. Change its cost to 0. That's a mouthful. So to make a long story short, White Wolf is basically to set up some sort of late game finisher. You wouldn't put an 8 mana 4/4 into your deck unless your win condition was as expensive as 8 or more. So as it stands, this doesn't fit into a deck like Tempo Forestcraft. But we do already have a couple of expensive Forestcraft finishers, including Rose Queen and Silverbolt. With a card like this, I think there probably will be a new Forestcraft late game finisher to work with it, but just looking at Rose Queen and Silverbolt right now, if you put this into a Rose Queen deck, it would be the same clock, meaning you normally play Rose Queen on 8, and then you use the Thorn Bursts on 9. Instead you would play this on 8, and then on the next turn you would have a free Rose Queen, you would play the free Rose Queen, and then you would play the Thorn Bursts on 9, just like you would before. Gives you a little more tempo though, you have a 4/4 rush on turn 8 instead of a vanilla 5/5. The Silverbolt dream though is that you play White Wolf on 8, draw a 0-cost Silverbolt, and then on turn 9 you combo a full-cost Silverbolt with the 0-cost Silverbolt for massive damage. So I think it's good setup for an expensive late game finisher. Minor setback is that there is a tempo loss, you're playing a 4/4 on 8 mana, but it does have rush. Right now the overall score is +1, but I expect to see some new Forestcraft cards that work with this in this set. So possibly a new deck on the horizon. Second Forestcraft card, Crystalia Tia, 2 mana 2/2, enhance 6, transform an enemy follower into a snowman. So this is flexible single target removal. If you're up against a fast deck and you have to play a minion on turn 2, you have this, you can just drop it on the board. But if you're against a slower deck, you can hold on to it until turn 6 or later and then transform a big threat into a 1/1. So as far as fitting it into existing decks go, Tempo Forest does run single target hard removal, and you could swap this in for a little more flexibility. Combo and Path to Purgatory Forest, however, usually runs Will of the Forest as flexible single and multi-target removal because they keep a large enough hand to get a lot of damage out of it, so you probably won't be fitting it into one of those decks. So overall score +1 if you're running Tempo and you want a little more flexibility, but obviously for the other decks you probably would stick with Will of the Forest. Onto Havencraft, Master Sage, 3 mana 1/2. At the end of your turn, subtract 1 from the countdown of all allied amulets. A lot of people seem to think this is a good card and is a replacement for a Sister. I'm going to have to be the dissenting opinion. This card has terrible stats obviously, but more importantly this card is slow. Even though the countdown reduction hits all amulets on the board, it comes at the end of your turn, which means it has bad synergy with Rush amulets and Sacred Plea. A lot of times you'll have a Rush amulet on the board or a Sacred Plea with 1 countdown left, and you just want to pop it right away so you can get your cards or get your Rush minion on the board. Not only can you not do this, but your Rush minions will be sitting there during the enemy's turn. You will never have gotten a chance to attack with them. I just don't see Master Sage working with any of the decks that are out there. Obviously Stormhaven wants their minions out as soon as possible, and all of the variants of Haven want their cards from Sacred Plea as soon as they can get them. So I'm going to have to give this an overall score of -2. For Runecraft, we have Craig, Wizard of Mysteria, 2 mana 2/2, Fanfare, spell boost a follower in your hand 2 times. This is an interesting effect, but as of right now there is no minion based spell boost deck. There are only a handful of spell boost minions available, including Lightning Shooter, Emmylou, Mithril Golem, and of course Runeblade Summoner and Flame Destroyer. Flame Destroyer and Runeblade Summoner pretty much only see play in Dimension Shift decks because they're getting spell boosted for the finisher. Lightning Shooter doesn't see play because Wind Blast is a card. You spell boost Wind Blast, then you play Wind Blast, and then Wind Blast spell boosts the rest of your hand. Whereas Lightning Shooter does the same thing without spell boosting the rest of your hand when you play her. So basically the deck that this card fits into doesn't exist yet, so I can't really give it a solid judgment. Maybe more minion-based spell boost cards will be released, and then there will be a minion-based spell boost deck. But until then it doesn't really have any purpose, so just overall score 0. Moving on. Shadowcraft, Pact with the Nether God. 3 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower with 4 or less defense. Enhance 7, then summon a Pluto, and give it +X/+X, where X equals the destroyed follower's attack and defense. This is a somewhat awkward middle ground between Deathbrand and Pluto. For 3 mana it does target things with 1 more defense than Deathbrand, but the main drawback is that this is a binary effect. You can only ever target followers with 4 defense or less. Even when you're paying 7 mana, it's either going to destroy a follower with 4 defense or less or do nothing to it. So even though it's technically worth the cost at 7 mana, you might not be able to kill the main threat that you really want to get off the board. If this was 3 mana deal 4 damage, it would be a lot better because it's not a binary effect, but binary effects always have limited use. So overall score -1 because there are better options available to Shadowcraft for removal. If you want to deal 4 damage, you can just run Undying Resentment, and if you want single target removal, you can just run Deathbrand or any of the other ones available. For Swordcraft, Gelt Vice Captain, 2 mana 2/2. This guy is an officer with Fanfare, gain +1/+0 and ward if you have a commander in play. So negative point, it's a worse on-curve play than Fervid Soldier or Veteran Lancer, since it's just a vanilla 2/2. And in most decks you put ward in your deck so that you have ward when you need it. So conditional ward isn't likely to see play in a standard deck. But for Banner Sword, which has Banner as a commander, which just sits there being a commander, the trigger of having a commander in play is not an issue. So for Banner Sword, you might switch out your Veteran Lancers for Gelt. It is slightly worse on turn 2, but it is better after you drop your banner. Overall score is 0. Second card for Swordcraft is Thief, 3 mana 2/2. Clash, draw a card. So again, this is a new mechanic where if the card attacks or defends from an attack, the effect procs. So regardless of whether you use this next turn to attack something or whether your opponent tries to clear it with a minion, you will draw a card, which makes it very likely that this will proc. And 3 mana draw a card has to be directly compared with Maid Leader. So on the plus side, this has better stats than Maid Leader. On the minus side, not nearly as good a waifu, but it is likely to draw a card. And if you're not concerned with drawing commanders, this could replace Maid Leader in a sword deck. Not a banner sword deck, of course, since you want the Maid Leader on 3 to draw a banner for turn 4, but any other Swordcraft deck might run this. Overall score, +1. And onto the neutral cards. Call of Casitas. 5 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower. Enhance 8, put a Servant of Darkness in your hand. So at 5 mana, it is basic hard removal. Unlike Execution, it can't target amulets, however. At 8 mana though, you get to remove something and put a whopping 13/13 for 5 mana in your hand. So on the plus side, this is flexible hard removal. You don't have to pay the 8 mana if you don't want to. You get to play it on turn 5 as just basic removal if you need to. On the minus side, Servant of Darkness is a very slow card that doesn't have a lot of synergy with most classes. Havencraft has the most synergy since they can ward it up with Guardian Sun, and they have a lot of stalls so that they can hold out until 8 mana and then play the 5 mana 13/13 on the next turn and then attack with a turn after that. But most other classes don't really have a use for it. There is the Demon Commander Laura Dream though. Overall score for this is going to be a 0, but I get the feeling plenty of people are going to try to put the 13/13 to use, and there will be decks including this card. And finally, the titular character himself, Bahamut. 10 mana 13/13. Fanfare, destroy all other followers and amulets, but can't attack the enemy leader if 2 or more enemy followers are in play. I'm surprised this guy only gets the standard +2/+2 when evolved. I mean, it is turn 10. It is freaking Bahamut. You could at least give him like +3/+3 or something. Realistically though, this guy does destroy amulets, so right off the bat, Seraph shuts it down. You're basically advancing your opponent's win condition if you play this when a Seraph is on the board. But even if you live in a world without Seraph, it's probably not going to be very competitive. You have to wait until turn 10 and then clear the board. If your opponent is overrunning the board at that point, it's probably too late to turn it around. And in most other games, the board is going to be getting out of control before turn 10, so you want your board clears a lot cheaper than 10 mana. Dragoncraft can of course cheat it out early, but even then if you're ramping and cheating out cards, you could just ramp out your win condition better than you could ramp out a table flip. So overall score is going to be -1. If I pull one in one of my packs though, I will put it in my Concede Haven deck just for the fun of it. And that wraps it up for part 1 of the Rise of Bahamut card reviews. Tune in again next time when we have some more to look at.